Globalisation and Education for All. Misguided, mismanaged or misunderstood. So, what is globalisation? Globalisation is an increasingly relevant word in modern society and has been defined in many different ways. These definitions differ from source to source and leave themselves open for questions to be asked. For example, Peam describes globalisation as a radical transformation of the world. However, this does not necessarily mean positive change and therefore does nothing to clear up the question of whether it is beneficial or not. However, some influential figures, such as former US President Harry Truman, publicly stated their support for globalisation as it could help the less fortunate realise their aspirations for a better life. But who judges the standards of how good a life is? Is quality of life really defined as how good Western society deems a life to be? A more technical definition of globalisation is that it integrates markets to provide greater flexibility in terms of world trade. And this view is supported by Shields, who believes that the world is transformed into a single economy as a result of interrelated changes. However, Griffin holds an opposing argument and likens globalisation to genocide because of the disastrous effects it can have.
In terms of education for all, at the Dakar Summit in 2000, UNESCO stated that education is a fundamental human right, and this led to delegates from 166 countries agreeing to provide greater access to education. As such, 6 goals were provided to improve education globally by 2015, and these were to expand and improve comprehensive early childhood education, all children have access to free compulsory primary education, which is also a Millennium Development Goal, ensuring the learning needs of all young people and adults are met, achieve 50% improvement in adult literacy, achieve gender equality, and to improve the overall quality of education.
In terms of preschool education, welfare has been improved and this has benefited many children. Whilst the work of Grantham McGregor et al. And UNESCO have promoted cognitive development and nutrition, children aren't getting what they need, and as such, free compulsory education is imperative. Although preschool enrolment has increased overall since the Dakar Summit, a high proportion of children are in private education. Development in the early years is pivotal, but children are being priced out of their education, and if we truly wish to help, then we should fight to provide free education for all in the name of equality.
In terms of primary schools, in 1999 enrolment rates were 84%, which rose to 91% in 2012. However, since 2007 this figure has stagnated. Whilst the improvement sounds encouraging, in terms of lives there were 58 million children not in primary education worldwide. 19 million of those out of school are also suffering from some form of disability, which has led to the Department for International Development prioritising such students in their educational strategy. Enrolment increased across major continents. However, rates fell across Northern America and Western Europe by 2%, and some credit this to homeschooling doubling. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, enrolment rates improved by 20% from 1999 to 2012, which shows great progress. However, despite this improvement in initial enrolment, dropout rates are still poor, with more than 20% in some continents failing to reach the final grades.
Total secondary enrolment increased by 27% worldwide, with improvements of 85% at lower secondary school, 62% in upper secondary, and 10% in vocational education. Only rates in Central and Eastern Europe decreased, with 26% fewer students enrolled in lower secondary education. Now, 94 lower and middle income countries made constitutional changes to improve attendance and reduce barriers to make lower secondary education free. However, it is worth noting that not all countries provide free secondary education, as countries such as South Africa and Botswana are charging for this fundamental right. Barker believes that even a small charge can act as a disincentive towards education, and as such, children will not fulfil their potential.
Despite a goal to reduce adult illiteracy by 50%, in 2015 there were an estimated total of 781 million adults without literacy skills. In relative terms, in 2000, 18% of the world's adults were illiterate, falling to 14% in 2015, which means that the aim was far from met. In fact, of the 73 countries with a literacy rate below 95% in the year 2000, only 17 had reduced their illiteracy rate by 50%. Sub-Saharan Africa had the highest literacy rate in 2000, and by 2015 they had the lowest improvement rate of only 13%. UNESCO believes that countries are tackling the goal as a long-term target, with the main tool of combat being high-quality education. Children are being prioritised over adults, leading to a shift in culture for many. Despite such a focus, many children are still illiterate after finishing primary education.
Gender equality is something which has recently come back to the forefront after being championed by Malala Yousafzai, who was targeted for standing up for women's rights by terrorists who were so scared of her words that they retorted with gunfire. Now, UNESCO predicted that by 2015, 69% of countries would have achieved gender parity in primary, but only 48% at secondary level. Countries with parity increased from 36 in 1999 to 46 in 2012, and this saw an increase in North America and Western Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, and in East Asia and the Pacific. However, Sub-Saharan Africa, Arab states, Central Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean all saw decreases in countries with gender parity. Barker suggests parity is falling in some countries because privatisation is increasing inequality. Girls are more likely not to have a chance to be educated compared to their male peers. However, males at schools are more likely to leave and tend to, on average, achieve lower grades than females. The statistics seem to be most concerning in sub-Saharan Africa, where in some countries over 70% of disadvantaged girls never have the chance to attend primary school.
In terms of improving the standards of education, there were several key things that were noted. Firstly, primary class size is reduced in 83% of the countries, with there being more teachers per pupil. But 33% of countries which provided data had over a quarter of untrained teachers, which may restrict education standards. However, countries are increasingly attempting to understand their education systems through nationalised learning assessments, with 34% in 1999 to 69% in 2013 using at least one assessment. According to the Education for All Global Monitoring Report, there are 250 million children who don't have basic skills, which can lead to reduced chances to live fulfilling lives. This reinforced the findings of the World Bank, who stated that 3 out of 10 youths were unable to use and understand basic arithmetic in developing countries. However, no data is recorded on skills appropriate for their society and culture.
India is a specific example of the failure of education for all, and we show this by going through the goals of UNESCO's Education for All document. Early childhood enrolment is something which varies greatly on background. There is an obvious clash between culture and the education system. Up to 95% of disadvantaged children are in government-sponsored care centres known as Anganwadis, and other castes make up the majority of privately educated population. High proportions of children are enrolled in Anganwadis, however few attend regularly, which could restrict their educational futures. Highlighting India's gender crisis, there are more girls in the government-sponsored education system than boys, whereas there are more boys in private education than girls.
In terms of primary school, universal primary education has been a goal since India gained independence. Although net enrolment surpassed 95% in 2007, again many children attend private schools. Almost 70 million children are enrolled in public primary schools and approximately 13 million are enrolled in private primary education. It is clear that the proportion of pupils in private primary education has increased, almost doubling in rural areas. Even with the growing popularity of private education in India, quality of education is still a major issue. Over 50% of students are 2 years behind in terms of basic skills.
Time spent in secondary education has increased by over a year in the last full decade, and this is something which coincides with an improvement in secondary enrolment. However, there are still high dropout rates and disadvantaged pupils are most likely to leave education. There is also a serious teacher shortage in Indian schools, and this has gone to the extent that schools are having to hire many untrained teachers. The attempt to rapidly increase enrolment in education in order to compete globally has been a major factor in India's downfall, and the fact that an education system which is seen as being appropriate in Western culture, which may not necessarily be culturally or socially accessible to those in India, could lead to hindering them in the future.
Almost 290 million adults in India are illiterate, although the literacy percentage has increased. However, whilst this looks like growth, due to population change, the number of people who are illiterate has remained similar. A result of long-standing gender inequality in India means that men are more likely to be literate than women, and as such the gender parity score is 0.48, which is significantly lower than other regions. In addition, the rural communities are affected most, with rural women in particular being the most disadvantaged in terms of literacy. This may be because they are being forced to adapt their culture to fit Western expectations. However, studies have not been carried out to measure the contentment of these people, and despite being illiterate to our standards, they carry out vital work in the agricultural industry.
Ultimately, Globalisation and agendas such as education for all and the Millennium Development Goals may not be as positive as expected. The effects in India clearly demonstrate how a push towards such goals can actually make the quality of education worse and take culture away. Is universal enrolment worthwhile when education does not meet the needs of a society? Is the Western culture superior to others and should it be implemented elsewhere? We believe not. Finally, are globalisation and education for all misguided? Mismanaged?